Welcome to Prism Technologies. I am Venkat. This is part 8 of ASP.NET MVC tutorial. In this video, we'll discuss data access in MVC using Entity Framework. Please watch part 7 before proceeding with this video. Now, the controller responds to a URL request, gets data from a model, and then hands the data over to the view. The view will then render the data. Model can be either entities or business objects. And if you remember, in part 7 of this video series, we have built this employee entity which is going to act as the model in our MVC application. And if you remember, this employee entity is actually residing within the models folder of our MVC application. So here we have this employee class with this 4 auto-implemented properties. And within the employee controller class, look at this, we're actually creating an instance of this employee object, and notice that the employee data is actually hard-coded within this controller action method, and then we are passing this employee object to the view for rendering. Okay, but in reality we actually retrieve the employee data from a database table. So here I have this table tblEmployee. So we want to retrieve data from this table and then build our employee model object and then hand that employee model object to the view, which will then render that employee. Okay, so let's see how to retrieve employee data using Entity Framework. Now, if you remember, your models can be either entities or business objects. In this video, we're going to use this employee entity and we're going to retrieve data using Entity Framework. In a later video session, we are going to discuss using business objects as our models. If you remember, business objects contain both state and behavior. Okay, so obviously in this video we are going to use Entity Framework to retrieve data from this table tblEmployee. Obviously, to do that, the first step is to install the Entity Framework, and the easiest way to do that is by using nuget package manager. So let's flip to Visual Studio, click on Tools, select Library Package Manager, manage NuGet packages for solution. So this should open up NuGet Package Manager, and look at this. At the moment, it's showing all the packages that are available for installation. Now, on my machine, I have Entity Framework already installed, and that's why I have this green tick mark here. If I don't have this installed on my machine, then I get a button like this, Install. Okay, so at the moment I don't have jQuery installed, so I have this button with install. Once you click that, it should automatically install that package, and then it should add a reference to that assembly. So since I have Entity Framework already installed on my machine, look at that, there is a reference added to Entity Framework. Okay, so that's the first step. And the second step is to add employee context.cs class file to the models folder. Let me add this class file and then we'll discuss the purpose of it. So let's flip to Visual Studio. So right click on the models folder, add a class file, and let's call this employee context. So employee context.cs. So let me actually copy a bit of code here and then we'll discuss the purpose of this employee context class. So if you look at this class, employee context class, it's inheriting from another class called DB context. So where is this DB context class present? First of all, we are getting a compilation error. Let's fix the compilation errors, and to do that, let me press Control dot. And look at this, this DB context class is actually present in system.data.entity namespace. So let's go ahead and use that using declaration. So using system.data.entity, and this DB context is present within that namespace. Alright, so this employee context class inheriting from DB context. So what is the purpose of this employee context class? The purpose of this class is to actually establish a connection to our database. So this table tblEmployee is actually present within the sample database. So this employee context class is going to establish a connection to our database. Okay, since it's deriving from DB context, this base class is going to do all that for us. And if you look at this employee context class itself, it has got this property, employees, a public property, which is returning a DB set of employees. So I'm going to get all the employees that are present in this table tblEmployee. And how am I going to get them? Using this property employees of this employee context class. Okay, so that's the second step. What's the third step? Obviously, if this employee context class has to create a connection, it needs to know about the connection string information. And what is the perfect place for connection strings? Web.config file. So the next step is to actually add a connection string to our web.config file, and to the web.config file that's presented within the root directory of our MVC application. So let me open this web.config file. Look at this. I already have a connection string here, and look at the name of the connection string. It's employee context. The name of this connection string matches with the name of our class, employee context. Okay, so when I create an instance of this class, it's going to look for a connection string with that name within web.config file. So we have a connection string there with that name, and then it's going to use this connection string. So obviously, if you look at the connection string itself, the server is dot, meaning the local installation of SQL Server, and then the database name is sample. I am using Windows authentication. The provider name is system.data.sql client, meaning it's SQL Server. Okay, so that's the third step. Add a connection string to the web.config file that's present in the root directory of your MVC application. And the fourth step, which is very important, look at this. By default, the MVC framework, look at the name of our entity. It's employee. So by default, the entity framework is going to look for a table with that name employee. But then what's the name of our table? It's actually tblEmployee. So we want this entity class to map to our table tblEmployee. So how do we do that mapping? Using table attribute. Okay, so let's go ahead and use the table attribute on this class. And how do we use attributes? By using square brackets. So table, and then what's the table to which this class needs to be mapped? tblEmployee. Okay, and obviously we have a compilation error because we need to import the namespace that this attribute is present in, and to do that, just simply press Control dot, and look at that. This table attribute is present in system.componentModel.data annotations.schema namespace. Okay, so we have that using declaration there. So that's our fourth step. And the fifth step, make the required changes to our controller action method. So at the moment, if you look at our employee controller action method, we have the employee data hard coded there, and we don't want to do that. We actually want to retrieve the data from this table tblEmployee. So obviously, to do that, the first thing to do is to establish a connection to the database. And how are we going to do that? Remember, we added this employee context class. So just create an instance of this class, which is going to automatically use the connection string that's present in the web.config file, create a connection for us. So let's do that. So employee context is equal to new employee context. And then remember, this class, this employee context class, has got this property employees. So employee context dot employees property, which is going to return list of employees, all the employees, the DB set of employees that's present in this table. But remember, what I want to do is I don't want all employee details. I just want one employee detail. Okay, so how am I going to get a specific employee details? What I'm going to do at the moment is, to this controller action method, I'm going to pass in a parameter with name ID, which is going to be the employee ID for whom I need the information. So I'm going to filter the employees based on the ID that comes into this controller action method. So I have the list of employees here. From this list, I'm going to get a single employee. Look at that. I'm actually using a link query here. So I'm going to get a single employee. So emp such that employee object dot employee ID is equal to whatever ID that we are passing into this function. So this is going to return, the single method is going to return, look at the return type, it's going to return a single employee object. So I'm going to store that within this object reference variable. Let's call it employee, and then what I do, I hand that employee object to the sphere. Now We will discuss about Entity Framework in a very great detail in a later video series, and similarly we'll also talk about link in a later video session. So here we are trying to understand how to populate our model with data from a database table using Entity Framework. Okay, the specifics of Entity Framework are beyond the scope of this video, but we'll be discussing about them in detail in a later video session. Alright, so we hand over the employee object to the view will take the responsibility of rendering that as required. Alright, so that's the fifth step, and the final step is to actually use this method set initializer. Let me actually paste this method in global.asix file, and then we'll discuss what is the purpose of that method call. So the final step is within global.asix file. So there is this application underscore start event handler which gets executed at the beginning, when your application first starts. And then here I'm going to invoke this set initializer method of database class. Again, this database class is present in system.data.entity namespace. So let's go ahead and import that. So what is the set initializer function going to do for us? Now look at this. We are actually using this database. Sample database is an existing database. It's not a new database that we are creating. We have an existing database, and within that we have this table tblEmployee which has got already some sample data. Now what is the purpose of this set initializer function? Look at the IntelliSense. It's basically used to initialize our database. Okay, if you don't have the database already created, it's going to create a database for you, create tables for you, and populate them with some sample data. But then we already have the database, the tables, and the data, so we don't want any initialization strategy. So for our employee context object, I am passing null, specifying that I don't want to have any database initialization strategy. So that's the importance of this line. Okay, so that's it. These are all the changes that are required. So let me now go ahead and run this application. So obviously when we first run this application, it's going to make use of the home controller and the index action method, but we actually want to go into employees controller, details action method within employees controller. And if you remember, this employees details action method, see employee controller, it has got details action method, and notice this has got an ID parameter. So now if you look at the URL here, I am passing ID of 1, so that will be passed into this controller action method, and then this employees property is going to return the database set of employees, but then out of them I only want the employee whose ID is 1, because we are filtering here using the single link method. Okay, which is going to return the employee with ID 1, which is then passed to this view. So now let me actually press enter there. We should get the employee ID with 1. So employee with ID 1 is Mark, and we have his information there. So similarly, if I want Mary record, all you need to do is pass an ID of 3. Look at that, I get Mary's record. Alright. On this slide, you can find resources for ASP.NET, C# and SQL Server interview questions. That's it for today. Thank you for listening. Have a great day.